Welcome to the Campus Energy and Sustainability Podcast. In each episode, we talk with leading campus professionals, thought leaders, engineers, and innovators addressing the unique challenges and opportunities facing higher ed and corporate campuses. Our discussions will range from energy conservation and efficiency to planning and finance, from building science to social science, from energy systems to food systems. We hope you're ready to learn, share, and ultimately accelerate your institution towards solutions. I'm your host, Dave Carlscott. I'm the Vice President of Infrastructure, Energy, and Sustainability at Brailsford and Dunleavy.
Individuals can be familiar with like a credit score for an individual looking to get a mortgage or a credit card, and that affects your rating. I kind of think of the institutional credit rating as something similar, but for a bigger scale in the institution.
And I can say from the universities that we rate that have student housing P3s, that have energy utility P3s, we have not had a rating downgrade due to one of those P3 agreements.
In this episode, I'm joined by Jessica Wood of S&P Global and my B&D colleague, Katie Lutton. Our conversation explores how major infrastructure decisions are viewed through a financial lens and why that perspective matters for sustainability leaders. We discuss the ins and outs of institutional finance and how rating agencies and finance teams evaluate large-scale energy and infrastructure projects. For many of you, this may stretch your financial literacy, but it should give you a better understanding of how to fund institutional change. I hope you enjoy this conversation recorded in December 2025. Jessica and Katie, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
I wanted to start out by just kind of setting up the topic today. We have been doing a lot of work at B&D thinking about public-private partnerships. When you think about a public-private partnership, you think about how a project gets funded. The whole idea is, can you use private money to fund a public project? That then leads you into this conversation about how things are funded. We haven't really talked too much about the details about how funding works on a lot of the projects that we work on. This topic is funding transformational change. So the idea of getting lots of funding for a transformational project. In theory, this sounds pretty straightforward. In practice, there are so many rabbit holes to go down here. So I've got two guests here today that are going to hopefully help demystify some of the nuances, some of the big ideas, some of the little gotchas that you kind of need to understand to get into this topic. So let's start with you, Jessica. Just tell us a little bit about who you are and why I might have asked you to join this podcast.
Thank you, Dave. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Wood. I'm a managing director at Standard & Poor's or S&P Global Ratings, but really I'm a ratings analyst. I've been at S&P since 2010, and as a ratings analyst, we assign credit risk ratings to public bond issuance if requested. And our rating scale spans, from AAA, the highest rating, all the way down to a default or a D. And essentially what we're doing is assessing bond obligors' willingness and ability to service debt. And so that's sort of our connection to these types of P3 deals that are bond financed and how we're involved kind of.
Great. Katie.
Yeah, as you know, a colleague of yours at Brailsford and Dunleavy in our Infrastructure, Energy, and Sustainability practice group. So I get to work with our clients, largely colleges and universities, but also other institutions, helping them solve their physical project problems on the infrastructure side. So whether it's initial planning on strategy or how to get things financed, how to get things done, who's the right partner for them if they want to go a partnership route. So that's my effort and how it intersects with what we're talking about today.
Well, excellent. So when I was thinking about this episode, I was thinking about how I thought about project finance in a university context or just university finances in general. And I would characterize it as follows, and I think this is probably how a lot of sustainability professionals think about this, which is, A, you've got to think of a really interesting project. B, you've got to get lots of people at the institution really excited about it. C, you have to come up with some pitch that ultimately goes in front of your CFO at the university. And you need them to give you a thumbs up that says, yes, we are going to pay for this. We're going to do this. So it's this sort of like begging for money sort of scenario. As I've been in this industry now for a long time, I've realized that's not actually how it works. When you're talking to CFOs, they're thinking about a lot of things that I think the average people don't really understand or have never really thought about. So they're thinking about, the debt capacity, the rating of the institution, kind of like your credit rating for an individual. They're thinking about long-term affordability of the institution. They're thinking about how is this project going to affect tuition rates? How is this going to affect our ability to build that next big building? How am I going to deal with the president's next big pet project that's coming down the pike? So today, I think we can dig through this a little bit and tease apart the pieces there. When I thought about this, I thought, most people are scared to finally get that meeting with the CFO or maybe get all the way to the board of directors and get a project approved. But there's actually somebody even above them who those people are actually scared of or are looking to get the approval of. And Jessica, for today's purposes, you're going to be that person. I know that's not actually true in reality, but for today, you are the person the CFO fears. So can we talk just a little bit about the fundamentals of how that works, or when you're talking to university clients, how they're thinking about long-term finance?
Sure. I will comment. I don't think that the CFOs and management teams are scared of us. I hope not. We try to be as transparent as possible and speak to management teams, as often as they like throughout the year as updates come in. But I think you're right in that CFOs, presidents of universities and CFOs have really the hardest job out there right now. And if you look at sort of the evolving industry and evolving times where there's a lot of headline risk, there's cyber risk, there's so much that management teams need to think about. It's a big job. I think in terms of working with and speaking with the rating agencies, I think our criteria and methodology in terms of those credit ratings is fairly transparent, and we do try to keep in touch with schools to sort of alleviate or mitigate some of that fear. But at the end of the day, I think the CFOs at these institutions are juggling so much. They have different department needs. From a budget standpoint, there's a lot going on. I think where we come into play is for universities that have requested and hold and maintain a credit rating, which is an assessment of, as I said, sort of the institution's willingness and ability to service debt, or their credit score, if you will. That's out there publicly. And for a lot of these high-profile institutions, it is important to them to maintain that rating. It can be a reputational impact, but also it can affect cost of capital and just sort of how their bonds are trading or just overall weighted cost of capital. So that's, at the end of the day, I think that's the reason why management teams are very focused on the credit rating. But I would end that answer with also the fact that sometimes what a university needs to do strategically just doesn't align with maintaining a rating. Over the years, when schools have maybe some big strategic investments that are going to long-term position the institution where they need to be, that might not align with the current rating that might experience a decline, but could come back later. So there's a lot of things that these CFOs need to think about.
Great. Katie, I would welcome from your perspective, because I know you've been on this journey understanding this with me over the last couple of years, but can you tease apart exactly what all those things mean? Like, what is a credit rating from your perspective? How have you grown to understand it? I think you're closer to not remembering what it was to now.
Yeah, this is not a perfect analogy, but most individuals can be familiar with like a credit score for an individual looking to get a mortgage or a credit card, and that affects your rating. I kind of think of the institutional credit rating as something similar, but for a bigger scale in the institution or a specific project. It's interesting because sometimes as a president or as a strategic leader, you might be judged on more intangibles of how is the university doing in general, and people have different opinions, but a credit rating is pretty tangible and it's public. So I think more so than sometimes other indicators of a university's success or achievement, sometimes people in the finance world can look, are they stable? Have they declined? Maybe it is a decline for a strategic reason, like Jessica mentioned. So I'm not saying up is always good and bad is always down, but it is just a reflection of that ability and willingness to pay those debts. So I think for that reason, presidents and CFOs are rightly focused on what their rating is now, what their goals are, what's going to impact that. And I think it's good to hear about that constant communication that Jessica mentioned. So things aren't unexpected, I guess, and they are able to make decisions, understanding likely impacts to a potential rating.
Maybe just for purposes of talking about the range, Jessica, I know you said in your intro kind of like what your scale is, like what a great rating is and what a maybe not a great rating is. Can you just speak to that a little bit, just so people understand it? Like, how does, maybe using personal credit as kind of a rough metaphor?
Sure. Yeah. So using personal credit, you have your high score and then your not so high score. And when you're going to buy a car or buy a house, it becomes even more important. For universities, when they're issuing debt, when they're in the market, that bond rating becomes maybe more important because investors are looking closely at that information. But the range and the way that our criteria works for higher education is we'll look at enterprise profile credit characteristics and we'll look at financial profile credit characteristics. And then those sort of come together into a matrix. And then based on our conversations with management teams and a forward-looking view, that will ultimately shape via a credit committee with some of my colleagues, will shape what the ultimate bond rating is. And then investors can look at that and they'll run their own credit scores, if you will, but then they'll be able to look to sort of that third-party information and assessment and can also look across at peers and do their own analysis. But that's essentially how it works. And there are a lot of different things that go into that. On the enterprise side, we're assessing the market scope of the university, the enrollment and demand picture, what that looks like, the selectivity. We're looking very closely at management and governance and how that operates and scoring management based on our assessment and views. And then we're looking at their overall strategic planning and what that looks like and what trends have looked like over time. And all of that assessment evolves too with sort of what's going on in the market in terms of, demographic pressures and where we see that maybe impacting schools more so than others. So things like that. On the financial profile side of things, we're looking at operations, operating margins, and how schools are performing year over year relative to budget. But we're also looking at that balance sheet or sort of that treasure chest that schools have been able to sort of continue to grow over time via fundraising, via investment returns. And that sort of provides a little bit of a backstop should schools, have a challenging operational year. They might be able to pull a little bit more from their endowment draw or things like that.
Yeah. So if somebody did borrow money, I guess your kind of default thought would be the more money you borrow, the lower your rating gets because you've, kind of maxed out your credit card kind of thing. I know that's not actually true. And maybe could you give some examples of how certain types of borrowing might actually improve the credit rating or at least keep it neutral?
Yes. So we've seen a lot. We've seen an increase in endowment borrowing over the past several years. During COVID, we saw, I would say pre-COVID, it was maybe a handful to a dozen schools across our rated universe that were maybe taking an extraordinary draw, which we would define as something maybe over 5%, which is about market. Most schools take about, on an annual basis, take about 5% of some sort of weighted average of the market value of their endowment over several years and use that towards operations, typically towards scholarships and things like that. What we saw during COVID was many schools sort of increasing that endowment draw to cover gaps. And that was probably in between, before we saw the emergency funding coming through from the federal level. But over the past several years, as we've kind of emerged post-COVID, we have seen many more schools just increasingly challenged on the liquidity front and operational front as we've seen enrollment challenges growing. Expenses have been rising. And so we've seen many more schools taking what we view as sort of that extra draw, maybe a 7-8%. To your question, it's not always a bad thing. That's what it's there for. Not necessarily all of it, but that's why, you have that cushion. So, a one-time event, maybe 1 year, maybe a school made some material investments in some part of campus and decided to, with board approval, to finance that with an extra draw or increase their discount rate and needed, more funding towards scholarships and those types of things. Those things can be positive for the institution, maybe not immediately, but over time. But when you see a school consecutively taking larger draws from the endowment year over year and depleting that quasi-endowment or the liquid portion of that endowment, then schools can run into some liquidity trouble. And we tend to view that more negatively when it becomes a trend of several years of borrowing.
Great. Maybe, Katie, there's this idea of the university credit rating, but then I know we also get into project finance, which is a little different. Maybe can you just kind of broadly introduce that idea and then
Sure.
we can let Jessica walk us through it.
I was going to say, I'm not the full expert. I'm glad we have Jessica here, but it's come up on some of the projects that I've worked with different universities on. There's the underlying rating of the university as an issuing body is holistically the identity of this university has X credit rating based on all these factors that may be stable, may be changing. But then each individual project, depending on how it's structured, if there's debt issued for a certain project, how that debt will be repaid can get its own special rating that might be the same as similar to the school rating if it's closely tied, or if it's distant, like, hey, the debt for this project is going to be funded by the revenues from this project, not by the school directly. There's a bunch of other, I'm sure, ways this can be set up, but those are reasons I think that the debt for the project can be rated differently than the university as a whole, just based on contingency planning, the degree to which the university is providing a backstop, the degree to which there's coverage from the university versus standalone coverage based on project revenues or other sources of income for a specific project. So I think it's interesting as schools consider whether it's a housing project, energy infrastructure, or any kind of a strategic initiative that takes a lot of upfront capital, how that project financing is structured can affect how closely that rating is tied to the school's underlying rating.
Yeah, and I guess just explain a little bit about, like, maybe a housing project's a good example. How is that different than, say, borrowing for a new academic building?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all connected because, of course, with a new academic building, maybe you're going to attract more students and you're going to be able to house a special program that is going to drive enrollment, but it's a little bit more indirect. With housing, there's each individual dorm, for example, or student housing facility could have a direct revenues from students living in that dorm and paying room and board to live in that new facility. So when we look at some housing projects, we'll model out the project economics. What are the revenues and expenses of this housing project, both during construction and then once it's ongoing in operations? And that's where I think you can get more project-based financing that could leave the rest of the university's funds open for other things. It's not like they have to commit to fund it directly if the project is projected to drive enough revenues. And those economics can be helped or hurt, affected by the degree to which the rest of the university's funds are put at risk, or say, hey, we'll back this up if students don't come and the building is vacant, or if it's doing great and there's extra revenue because there's upward pressure on rents. Housing is one specific example, but I'm curious, Jessica, how you see that in your line of work, the relationship between the overall rating of the institution and the project specifically.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think one thing I would add is, well, two things. One, I think from the perspective of the bond rating, and kind of put very simply in sort of bond 101, the first thing we always look at when we get the POS is the bond security. Like you said, what's the revenue flow, or what are the funds that are going to secure and pay that debt service? And so one big differential, if it's a student housing project as compared to maybe an academic building that's being financed by the university, those bonds for the academic buildings most typically are issued by the university and are going to be backed by the full faith and credit, or what we call a general obligation pledge, or something similar to that. And what that essentially means is that there's a much bigger pot of money backing the bond repayment and the debt service on those bonds. When you have a student housing project, often, like you said, it's a much more narrow security pledge. It's typically, project cash flows. Maybe it's one building. And so as you're modeling that out, those bonds are reliant on the revenues from those rents, those leases, to pay that debt service ultimately. It's just a more narrow pledge, and that's the differential in the bond rating.
So, Jessica, from your perspective, you're working for both the university to help navigate the process of them being rated, but you're also working on behalf of the investors to some extent, because you're the one this is debt that's worth borrowing. Can you explain that relationship a little bit? I have a couple follow-ups, and maybe I don't have that right.
Yes, I would probably put it a little bit differently. When a bond rating is requested, we're providing that bond rating to the issuer. That's typically who requests it. That issuer, that university, might work with a financial advisor, underwriters, bankers. So at the end of the day, those are all our constituents in that they have an interest in our report and what we're putting out there. The investors are another constituent base that often subscribe to or look to our rating reports as sort of a third-party view as they're making their decisions about what bonds to purchase. Most of those investors are doing their own internal assessments and bond ratings, but they also tend to like to see those third-party reports and assessments. So when we're doing our work and assessing willingness and ability to service debt in the bond rating, we're looking to our criteria methodology and we're publishing those reports. But that's really where our role ends. And then when the bonds are sold in the market, that's sort of round two, and we're not a part of that.
You're not really part of that. Yeah. But I guess the question then is, you need to basically answer all of the questions that the investors want to know the answers to in your reports, correct?
Right.
Like that's really what you're providing.
Yeah.
What types of questions do investors want to know the answers to for like a housing project versus like a general obligation bond? I want to get into energy and infrastructure projects next, but
Sure.
let's start with just housing. That's a more straightforward example.
Yeah. And I think that, our criteria and methodology, I think for the most part aligns, or I think we try, and throughout those reports and what we're putting out there, fundamentally, when we're assessing credit, we're kind of getting to what the investors are looking for as well, what drives that credit strength and what the risks are. And then along the way, we talk to investors all the time. So as we're hearing what investors are more and more focused on, that can have an impact on our report. So just before answering your question, for example, this year, as there's been a lot of focus on research funding, while we've always talked about research funding as part of our reports and in our analysis, we earlier this year kind of moved that paragraph up to the front page of our reports and started adding some of the detail that we talk about in committees that wasn't always in the reports, such as what's the indirect cost recovery rate, how much of that research funding is from the federal government. These types of things that we were getting calls from investors on, we sort of real time moved around and made sure those were up in front. In terms of, can you repeat that?
Yeah, that's helpful. And because they want to know, for example, if a university is heavily reliant on federal funding, that affects their entire financial picture, I think is what you're saying there. My question really comes down to, let's take a housing project. Let's just say it's a university-led housing project. They're borrowing money for a housing project. How is that different than borrowing money for an academic building?
Yeah. If the university is issuing debt for a housing project, most typically, depending on if it's a public or private, but say it's a private university, most bond issuance by a private university is a general obligation pledge. So they'll issue general obligation debt. For investors, they will care more with, say that bond issue goes to market. While they will want to know, what's housing occupancy? What does that look like on campus? Is enrollment growing? Is there a lot of demand for housing? Will the housing be full? While they will care about that, they will care less than if that project was financed solely by project revenues. They will care more about the underlying university credit profile and long-term viability. So the financial profile, the enrollment profile, and that's what investors will be focused on rather than the housing project because of how the bonds are secured.
So basically, if I was a really wealthy, heavily endowed university in a terrible housing market, I could still borrow money to build new housing because they're looking at my ability to pay it. It's almost like the ability to have a second summer home, even though I barely use it. Maybe let's talk about why public-private partnerships then are important. Because if the opposite's true, and you're maybe an institution with little to no endowment, you're strained financially, but you need housing to kind of get out of your strained financial scenario, how would these projects be shaped differently to answer these questions?
So I think, looking back, I started at S&P in 2010, so it's been 15 years. And back then we rated probably only 20, 25 of these student housing projects. Today it's, double, maybe triple. And what we've seen is, number one, for schools, it's been a way to get housing more quickly, more efficiently, especially for public universities. There's just a lot of red tape, and it takes a very long time to kind of get those doors open on the housing. So it's efficiency, it's outsourcing expertise. But then to your point, it also can provide more flexibility from a debt standpoint. If you have a university, say it's sort of middle of the road, decent balance sheet, decent enrollment, but just doesn't have the big pockets, the P3 is a way for them potentially to open a new dorm, to improve their housing capacity, their demand, while not sort of using, quote unquote, using their balance sheet or issuing debt. I think that's in short, sort of.
Great. And I'm leading up to this energy infrastructure because it's a little different. But if that happened, let's say you had a middle of the road university, they're not declining, going out of business, but they're not thriving or they're not heavily endowed. So there's two different ratings there, right? There's the project rating for the housing, but there's also the university's rating. What's the relationship between those? Say you get a decent rating on the housing, it's a good project, there's good demand, the investors want to invest in it. How does that affect the university's rating, or does it?
From the university standpoint, if a university completes a P3, when we're going to committee and we're completing our review and when we're talking to management, we want to know about it. Any potential partnerships, operating partnerships that a school enters into could potentially create risk, long-term risk, operating risk, whether or not there's financial or legal recourse to the university. So we'll just want to understand that partnership. Oftentimes, as you know, these partnerships, these P3 partnerships are long-term in nature. It's like a marriage. It could be 40, 50 years, hopefully longer than that for most marriages. But generally, we're looking to assess sort of how that relationship, how those agreements are working and how all of that works. From a university rating standpoint, if a project is sort of typical in nature to what we rate. We will see a P3 student housing project that is maybe on university land, maybe adjacent. There'll be some sort of ground lease with the university. There'll be some sort of involvement with their agreement with the university to provide maybe some basic services that they provide to their other housing, maybe security, maybe something else. Or it might be more minimal in that they just put the P3 housing project on their website as an offering, and that might be it. But regardless of that, if that P3 project there's bonds related, sometimes we rate them, sometimes we don't. And if those bonds are secured by project cash flows, but the bonds are non-recourse to the university, we will not include that debt in our university analysis. We will consider it off-balance sheet debt or indirect debt. We will talk about it, but we will not include it in our debt ratios. So from that perspective, it does save on debt capacity, if you will. All those other aspects, the partnership and that operational agreement, and really just how that project is doing over time in terms of occupancy, et cetera, becomes more important because we have now seen some examples where maybe the P3 student housing project doesn't do well and the university buys it out. Or for other reasons, the university buys it out. So there is that potential that the university at some point will absorb that debt. But for general purposes, we wouldn't include that in our ratios, but it would be talked about in our reviews to sort of see how things are going and if there's any potential impacts to the school or their underlying credit.
Okay, great. Katie, anything you feel like that needs clarification there? I mean, it's hard to remember not knowing this now that I've spent so much time thinking about it.
No, I think it's really important what you said, Jessica, that it's not necessarily in the debt ratios, but it is included in the overall review since it's such a holistic kind of review and discussion section. So when people say things like, oh, it's off credit, it's a term I think that is a little bit more nuanced than that, in that maybe it's a certain project debt, depending on how it's structured, might not be included in the debt ratios, but it could still be a factor in the holistic view of an institution. So it's helpful to hear you lay out exactly where those show up.
Yeah, and I guess from a personal finance perspective, and see if this makes sense, Jessica, you can correct me if this is a bad analogy or not, but I think of things like when you're going to buy a house, there are certain things that will show up as debt that you owe that the mortgage lender will look at to determine whether they want to loan you the money or not. They'll include things like child support or some type of student loan payments, but there may be some things that don't show up in that ratio that you don't necessarily need to report, like your ability to pay. It shows up, it's part of the overall financial picture, but it may or may not be part of what they're looking for to determine whether you meet the threshold for their lending. Is that a fair assessment, or am I going too far there?
I think so, yeah. Meaning they're there, but they aren't currently affecting your score.
Yeah, like basically the lenders have a very narrow view on what they're really focused on, and it may fall outside of that. That's really what that means. It doesn't mean that there's not an obligation or that there isn't some risk that they have to pay something.
Right.
And you as the rating agency actually do look at all of that, is what I understand.
Yeah, to Katie's comment earlier, I mean, I think the term that's been thrown around the industry for the past, since I've been working here at 2010 is the off-balance sheet. I don't really think there's much that's off credit, honestly. I mean, I always say that any P3 or any partnership that a school's signing a contract is on credit, but just might not be in the ratios. It's just on credit, meaning it's part of the conversation.
Okay, that's super helpful. And I wanted to get there before we move into if housing is P3 101. And it's pretty complex and dense. I hope, hopefully people are still listening at this point in the conversation, but we're about to ramp it up another notch. I'll start this one, and maybe Katie, I'll throw this to you at first. We talk a lot about infrastructure projects for an institution. They're not mission centric, meaning they're not like starting a new academic building or starting a new program, but they are mission critical, meaning you can't operate your science program without utilities, for example. You can't run a medical training center without the ability to have heating and cooling and backup power, et cetera. So they're absolutely necessary, but they're not the thing that you're going to get a donor typically to fund, or they're not the thing that you don't found an institution to use energy. You found an institution to teach people or do research, et cetera. So I guess, first of all, housing's a little different in that it's kind of like you can have an institution and not have housing at all. So it's even further away from the mission in some ways. Although if you start in the student experience of going to college, is actually very much part of it. So in that sense, it's very mission centric. First of all, let's just talk about infrastructure projects. Like what have you heard from people on how they think about them? And then as we start coming back into this debt, like borrowing money for them, how do we start thinking about that?
Yeah, in my experience on a lot of different campuses, it seems like sometimes infrastructure is a little bit out of sight, out of mind, or behind the scenes for most members of a school community, leadership, and students alike, except for the folks whose role it is to make sure things go well, make sure things don't break, make sure when you turn the light switch on, you have lights, make sure the chem labs have the right gas and hoods, and make sure everything is all connected and student experience is comfortable, functional, all those things. So there are indeed experts on every campus and running whatever campus infrastructure systems they have, but they can be a little bit behind the scenes for a large portion of the campus community. It can also be a little bit behind the scenes financially, if you will, because while it's pretty easy to have an understanding of a housing project economics, so you have revenues and expenses, on the infrastructure side, the whole definition of infrastructure is generally a large shared asset or a platform for a lot of different things to be supported. So it's not that you charge rent in the same way of who's living in the building, but it's kind of support a whole entire campus. And there's a shared cost element of that, which I think makes it a little bit more complicated and different on the project finance side. There's generally not an external customer like a student or a community member for a campus edge or for a housing project. Typically, the university itself is the customer, and it's sometimes you'll have internal customers. Maybe you're going to charge athletics. Maybe you're going to charge different departments. But even that has limits, and it's all within the umbrella of the institution anyway. So the revenue source is generally the school itself. There are some, I think, projects where maybe you have neighborhood off-takers if you're going to get into the district energy business. But in general, for chilled water, steam or hot water, power, those kinds of things, the institution itself is its own customer in a way that housing or other kind of more revenue-driven P3s is not the case.
So, Jessica, before we get into like energy P3 projects, which is like, probably the 301 course, let's just talk a little bit about how do you guys as a rating agency think about infrastructure in the institutional rating? I mean, do you think about that? Is that something that comes up, or are you just looking at tuitions and enrollment?
No, infrastructure is so important. I mean, part of the reason we visit campuses, I'd say the two big reasons are, number one, you want to meet management and get to know management in person. That's a big part of it, to sort of form some opinions there. But second, it's to see the campus and to see what the campus looks like. We can run the numbers and see the age of plant, but I think being on a campus and going through buildings, you can look at age of plant, you can look at depreciation, but you can get a sense of, okay, long term or over the next 5 to 10 years, what are the real needs of this institution? How much debt might they need to issue to sort of address aging infrastructure? So it's a very significant part of the assessment. It is touched on in our criteria, but it's not a focal point or a metric, but the age of plan is something we talk about, and just sort of like how that impacts what schools might need to do on their campus.
Great. No, that's super helpful, because I think one of the things I've been battling, back to your earlier point about there's not really anything that's off credit, meaning it all shows up somehow in the rating, but there are things that are off balance sheet. So there's been a lot of moves to try to do energy infrastructure projects that are off balance sheet, which is challenging to think about, especially if there's no new customer, right? Like, in a housing project, I can get my head around it. Like, I'm creating a business that did not previously exist that's now competing in the market for people that will pay rent. If I can offer it for cheaper and it's closer and more convenient, then I'm going to get that revenue that would otherwise go to other landlords around, or keep people from having to live at their parents' house or something like that. So it generates a new revenue stream. To Katie's point, it's like buried in the budget. Paying for infrastructure is so out of sight, out of mind in all ways. Like, people don't talk about it. It's kind of buried in the financials. You really have to dig for it. Yeah, you can see how much they pay for electricity and gas, but you don't really see how much of different people's job is maintaining that infrastructure. That's usually not something that you can even see in a financial statement. So if we start thinking about a project that uses third-party financing or a project finance structure, how can one even start thinking about that from a rating perspective? Like, I know that's not your team, but can you talk about that broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that similar to any sort of P3, there's the understanding of what's the agreement for, what in terms of what the school's doing, whether it's concessionaire or whatever type of P3 it is, why are they doing it? What are the needs? Typically it is aging infrastructure or renewal or sustainability. Then it's kind of looking at some of the terms, like how long is the term? Who are the parties involved? What are the financial impacts? Whether there's an upfront payment or not, how the payments will be utilized, and then what the university's financial obligation is, because often the university is making an annual payment, and how that might compare to what they've been paying historically annually for some of these utilities, et cetera. And then finally, it's sort of assessing, a credit opinion of the potential impact to the university financially or otherwise, operationally, and whether we see any potential risks. Those are the big questions, and then every project's different, and it's sort of assessing what that looks like and how it could impact the school.
Jessica, it's interesting to hear you talk about how that assessment process would go. When we're working with universities, we often try to understand, one, are there any opportunities for savings? Maybe you're going to get more efficient and you're going to save and reduce how much you're spending on electricity and natural gas or something like that. And that's always a great story. Sustainability-wise, financially, you're going to reduce your costs. The truth is that for a lot of types of infrastructure, even if you have a great savings program, you're still not going to fully offset the cost of the underlying infrastructure, whether it's piping or some other kind of big asset that's pretty capital intensive. So to make it make sense and to decide if this really needs to get done is to compare to what you would have to do otherwise. So I think hearing that your team, when they're, on a campus visit, for example, do take into account what are the capital needs in the next 5 or 10 years. And if a project addresses those, I don't know, maybe it's not the metrics in a quantitative way exactly, but it's in your overall evaluation that, this is an aging plan or this is a risk. They'll have capital needs in the future. A project that tackles those capital needs and maybe provides some savings on top of that could be strategically beneficial. So even though it doesn't have a true net revenue source, it's still addressing the underlying infrastructure that was a need anyway. It was a known need, known by the university and hopefully known by rating agencies and potential lenders. So what are you going to have to do anyways? What are your capital renewal needs? Whether you call it deferred maintenance or whether you call it modernization, which I think is maybe a better way to say it, but you probably have some underlying needs, and it's important to understand those when you think about any kind of infrastructure project.
I think that's right. I think it is kind of the cost of modernization. It's the sort of now or later. If you don't do it now, it's going to cost exponentially more later, and there might be some real sort of detrimental impacts to it. I mean, I think it's like, comparing to some personal stories, but when we bought a new home, we had to completely update the installation in the home. And I remember the third parties that were providing sort of the proposal saying, well, it's going to reduce your costs so each year. I don't know if I've ever gone back and looked at that spreadsheet to see if that's the case. But the reality is there's certain things you have to do from a modernization standpoint. It's like a lot of schools, I feel like over the years, had to replace all the sprinklers, in K through 12 and in some buildings, and you just have to do it. And so I think that's part of it.
And sometimes you have to do it, whether it's a code thing or something like that. But a lot of times, maybe you don't have to do it, but if you don't do it, you're taking on risk. And we've heard stories from clients or other higher institutions where the air conditioning breaks in the biggest freshman dorm on opening or on move-in weekend or something like that, that has not just a negative financial impact of now you need to rent emergency backup chillers or something like that, but also the student experience and the reputational risk, and that all, maybe you don't have to do it legally, but you're taking on risk if you don't do it. And eventually that risk can be significant if you do have an outage or some kind of unplanned interruption or event. You're almost paying for that not to happen.
I'm curious, Jessica, how do you think about those types of more catastrophic outcomes? How does that show up in the rating structure? Is that more of an outlook thing, or I imagine you don't try to zombie apocalypse your way through the ratings?
I always say, with some of the questions we asked, I always say, well, we sort of have to assess from a worst case scenario. That's just the life of a ratings analyst or a credit analyst. But we don't hypothesize catastrophic events. For example, no one could have expected COVID. No one could have expected what would happen, to student housing projects that were empty for many months, all of these things. Our ratings and criteria is flexible enough. We call that sort of event-driven risk. When you have something, whether it impacts the entire market or just some subsector of the market, we have the ability in our criteria to assess that. And maybe it impacts the rating for a short time period or maybe longer. That's how we assess things. In a current day rating, we're not saying, what if COVID happens again next year? We're not doing that. But we're just assessing the overall strength of an institution. And I think if we can take any lessons learned from event-driven things that have happened like COVID, it's that for these institutions, having a balance sheet, having some cushion, having contingency funds and liquidity is very important.
But would you look at, if you're doing an update to an institutional rating, last year, God forbid, but last year they had an explosion at their central plant. It had a life safety impact and there's big outages that shut off half the campus for a couple months. That's something that would come up in this year's rating renewal, is what I'm hearing.
Yes. So specifically, I'll give an example that's not P3 related, but was very public. When there's some sort of legal settlement or, some sort of litigation, I was the primary on Michigan State for many years. So when there was that $500 million settlement, the university, that $500 million settlement wouldn't necessarily have necessitated a downgrade, but the university issued debt to pay that settlement. The increased debt did impact their balance sheet ratings, and that resulted in a downgrade. But I will say on the risk standpoint, assessing schools' risk preparedness is also part of our criteria and methodology, and we spend time when we're speaking with management about the policies that they have in place, whether they have an ERP system, how it works. And so when there are situations, a cyber attack, we are spending time with management to understand, how prepared they were, how they reacted, what the potential financial and other impacts were on the institution. And we will assess that on a one-off basis with the institution that's had the impact. So if there is something, like you said, we would address it with the institution and see how they've handled it and what the potential impacts could be.
So it turns out governance and solid infrastructure matters, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, absolutely.
That's great. Any other kind of big picture messages? I guess, Jessica, if you're speaking to sustainability professionals, people that are, trying to drive transformational change, they're trying to basically get to the point where they can not only get the approval of their CFO, but their CFO gets confident that they can say the things that you and the other rating agencies want to hear, and that they're true. What advice would you give to sustainability professionals as they're thinking about this whole topic?
What drives a university's and institutions' strategic planning and strategic priorities, I don't think should be driven by what their credit rating is, because at the end of the day, an institution is going to have a long-term capital and master plan and strategic plan and a vision for their institution. I think secondly, student housing P3s have become kind of 101, more commonplace. Many schools across the industry do them. Energy P3s, not commonplace, but a good dozen or more, many schools have completed them. So there's some historical precedent. And I can say from the universities that we rate that have student housing P3s, that have energy utility P3s, we have not had a rating downgrade due to one of those P3 agreements specifically. So I think that statement should sort of alleviate, a management team's concern about entering into a potential project. It doesn't mean there couldn't be, but to date there have not been.
Katie, anything else you'd add?
Yeah, just that point about what sustainability or energy experts on a campus should be thinking about in terms of credit rating. It's just that it exists. It's something, I agree with you, Jessica, it shouldn't be driving campus strategy, but it is a factor, I think, in how leaders on a campus might make decisions. So understanding how a sustainability or an energy infrastructure project can fit into other capital priorities, whether you're doing something at the same time or bundling a project or making that connection of how this supports the campus stability or the campus in this way is useful. So tying those projects to the broader strategy.
So Jessica, I imagine you don't have an S&P swag store, so I'm not going to make you give the pitch for people to reach out. But I mean, if people do want to reach out to learn more about the work you guys do or learn about credit, et cetera, where would you send them?
Oh, sure. Well, we rate about 450 public and private universities across the country. We also rate about 20 universities internationally. We have a website, spglobalratings.com, or anyone can feel free to email me at any time if they have questions about the ratings process. That's jessica.wood@spglobal.com.
Awesome. I still want the t-shirt, but when you start making them. Katie, anything else to add as we close out?
No, this has been great, Jessica. It's really cool to hear and learn more about how you all look at these kinds of debt and the structures in your analysis. So thanks for sharing your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you for tolerating my crazy questions. I really appreciated the conversation. That's it for this episode. This podcast is proudly produced by Brailsford and Dunleavy. This episode was produced by Allison Bruns. A huge thanks to our sound editor, Kristen Crawford. Our theme music, Under the Radar, comes courtesy of Dallas-based musician and arranger Gio Washington Wright and his Studio Big Band. If you haven't already, be sure to follow Campus Energy and Sustainability Podcast on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. You can do a deeper dive on past episodes at campusenergypodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a quick rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It's a great way to get the word out about the show. As always, thanks for listening.